Okay. Let's see. Let's go live. Okay. Yes. Okay. So let's do this.
There we are.
Okay.
Just check this. Uh-oh.
Nope.
Oh, wait a minute.
Oh, is it working or no?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
All right. You're good to go.
Good evening. The program is titled The Founding Fathers. Let me begin by explaining who I'm talking about. Since a number of individuals from the period of time when the Constitution was framed could claim the title Founding Father, I'm talking about very specific founding fathers, those who attended the convention in Philadelphia in 1787, actually participated in the process and voted on a draft to be submitted to the Congress. So it's those folks I'm talking about who are the founding fathers. Like most people, what they were thinking is a product of their life experience. I assume that's true of you, and it certainly was true of them. The youngest of the founding fathers that I'm talking about was 26 years old. When you think about 1787, that means that he was so young at the time of the Revolutionary War and all of the events that led up to it, that he could have no real personal experience. It would all be secondary. The oldest was Ben Franklin at age 81. And Ben Franklin would be the exact opposite. It would be somebody who really experienced all of the events which produced the revolution and the period of time after the revolution, that from the time the war was over to the framing of the Constitution. So the life experiences that came to Philadelphia in 1787 would have been quite varied indeed. Their entire decades, generations, so to speak, from the youngest to the oldest were represented and represented rather heavily. There were, in fact, 55 of these founding fathers. That is to say, 55 delegates at one time or another attended the convention in Philadelphia and participated one way or another in the process. They weren't all there every day. As a matter of fact, only about 29 of those delegates attended what we would call faithfully for a variety of reasons. Some left almost immediately for family reasons. Some left after a few weeks because they didn't trust the process. Some left because they were unhappy with the decisions that were made. Some didn't show up until rather late in the process for a variety of reasons. So when we talk about the founding fathers, it ends up being, we're talking about a fairly narrow list of people who attended and participated rather fully. Now, these folks who attended came from a variety of backgrounds. It wasn't just the age that differentiated them. The youngest was from South Carolina, and the oldest was from Philadelphia. So those are quite different social, cultural settings for the experience that they had to be generated over the years. Let's take a look. This is a map generated for the period of time right after the revolution ended. That would have been 1783, 4 years prior to the time of the Constitutional Convention. The distances here are quite dramatic in terms of traveling time. That's Boston, roughly, and that's Charleston, South Carolina, roughly. That's a 13-day trip by water. Impossible to calculate what kind of a time would be taken to travel overland from Boston to South Carolina. I'm going to say it would be measured perhaps in months, and that may seem an exaggeration to you, but here's Philadelphia and here's Pittsburgh. That's a 1-month trip. Now the difference is the terrain. There are mountains and rivers to be crossed in that journey. So that adds to the time. And of course, weather is going to be a factor and all the other considerations for travel back then. There being, of course, no roads. There would be perhaps Indian trails, but no roads on that trip. In contrast, Boston and New York, the express riders for mail, and express is perhaps not the right word to use here, is 4 days. So it's a difficult trip again because of rivers and so on. On the other hand, during the Revolutionary War, word got from about Bunker Hill to Philadelphia in a day and a half. Now, that might be accomplished in a quite different way. That is a series of riders with fresh horses periodically and so on. So these times are offered only to illustrate that communication and exchange between people in different colonies would have been, states by this time, would have been really rather rare. And so to the extent that these folks had anything in common, it would have been by happenstance rather than a rather frequent occasion. Now, apart from the lack of interchange between many of the delegates, here in New England, this area generates lumber, fish, shipping. These are the sources, the economy of New England. In the South, that is to say in this area, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia, this is tobacco, rice, and indigo country. Almost, to the extent we're talking about an economy, almost entirely production for
What's area behind that?
farming, of course, is going to be common
Behind
in
what?
all of these areas. But farming in the South and farming in
mountains?
New England is really quite different. And so farmers' experiences are going to be different. Well, there's not much point in talking about farmers very long because none of the delegates to Philadelphia were farmers. Some of them were plantation owners, but not farmers in the sense that we would use that term. So the economies are quite different. And we're just talking about the extreme, the North and the South. There'll be quite different economy in the center states, if you want to call them, the mid-Atlantic states. In New England, the religion is, what shall I say? It is out in the open. It's a big part of everybody's life. It's a big part of the government. It is a driving force. To put it another way, New England is close to God and they want to make sure everybody knows it. That's sort of the attitude of the Virginians toward folks in New England. Am I suggesting there's tension between those folks? Absolutely there is tension. Because religion is such a big part of the government in New England, the New England delegates were suspect because the fear was they're going to try to make religion a big part of the government in the other areas of the country. And it simply was not. So quite apart from the differences that might occur between religious beliefs, the religious attitudes were really quite different. And then finally, there are many ways we could talk about differences, but one more. In New England, we govern ourselves by town meeting. That is, it's democracy. There's a leveling process, an equality process in New England. Nothing could be further from the way things are operated in the South, where the expectation from Virginia South, perhaps even Maryland South, the elite run the government. They are the government, and the common person simply defers to their betters. That is to say, those who are at a higher social class. And by the way, the social classes were a little bit rigid. That is, movement from one class to another was in the South particularly, and I must say also in Philadelphia, which would be the mid-Atlantic and presumably a more liberal place, that simply was not always the case. But we could look at startling examples like Ben Franklin, who came to Philadelphia as a poor boy and worked his way up to being the most outstanding figure in the city of Philadelphia and the most outstanding American in all of Europe. So obviously exceptions can be found to the generalities that I'm offering, but they are exceptions, and that's what makes the case. Well, in 1783, the United States existed. It came into existence in 1781, not 1776. We declared independence. When I say we, who am I talking about? Oh, New Hampshire, separate from Massachusetts, separate from Rhode Island, separate from, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there was no United States, even though the Declaration of Independence and something called the Articles of Confederation, more about that in a moment, were in existence. We simply were not united in any real sense. No common currency, no common economy, no common government. So this is a difficulty. We fought a war. We conducted the war, I should say. We conducted the war from 1776 to 1781 without a formal government. So if one wanted to be legalistic about it, nothing the government did from 1776 to 1781 had any legal authority. Of course, that made it very difficult to conduct the war. It's just one of the reasons the war went so badly as those years unfolded. But that aside, by 1781, they had reached an agreement, and that agreement was called the Articles of Confederation. And that Articles of Confederation gave status, legal status, to the combination, a confederacy, Articles of Confederation, a confederacy of 13 colonies. The problems with the Articles of Confederation were multiple. First of all, as a matter of its design, that is to say, the system, was seriously flawed. It was a voluntary agreement. I can't stress that enough. A voluntary agreement between the states. So what does that mean, voluntary agreement? Well, it means, among other things, that when the government asks that money be contributed, what we would call taxes, if money be contributed to the cause, that is to the cost of operating the government, it was up to the state to decide whether they wanted to pay, and if so, how much they were going to pay. So while the government, that is the Confederation, figured out a formula to ask Virginia, because it was the largest and the wealthiest of the states, to contribute, let's say, 5x. And it asked Delaware, the small state with a very limited population, to pay 1x. Well, Virginia might or might not pay the 5x. New Hampshire would have been in the 1x category. How much do you suppose New Hampshire paid? In 1785, Delegates 4 years after the government was formed. A Virginian wrote to another Virginian and said, New Hampshire has not paid a shilling and has no intention of ever doing so. So the voluntariness of this agreement is a serious flaw. Now, I've used one example, and that was the raising of money, but it's voluntary in every other way. You try to impose commercial regularity from the national government level, voluntary, whether the states want to participate or not. So the voluntariness is really a very serious problem. All of the power that existed, whatever power there was, that existed in the national government was in the legislature. There was no executive branch. There were no courts. So it was all in the legislature. Now I ask you to think, because it hasn't changed much over the centuries, I ask you to think about getting something done in the legislature where people are looking out for their own interest without looking to the national interest. Because it's a voluntary agreement, states sending delegates are going to be looking out for the state's interest. So how well do you suppose that legislature could function? Well, if you guessed not well at all, you would be quite right. Legislation in any setting, whether you're talking about the United States, whether you're talking about one of the states of the United States, whether you're talking about the Parliament in Great Britain, these are very difficult enterprises to operate. It really takes people of a particular kind, people who are able to look past their own interests, look past the interests of their friends, and look to a broader scope of interest. Those are rare individuals in any country, in any state. So this is the difficulty, putting all of the power in the legislature. Each state had equal voting power. Virginia, richest, most populated. Delaware, not so rich and very lightly populated, had exactly the same vote in that legislature. Isn't that odd? Well, that stems right out of the origins of 1776. The need was to unite in 1776 to deal with Great Britain. That was the single governmental issue before whatever you want to call the rump session of Congress. They called themselves the Continental Congress. The Continental Congress had the difficulty of dealing with that process. So with each state having the same voting power, combined with the other things that I've already described, this is really a dysfunctional operation. Well, let's change it. Can't we change it? Well, we could, except for this requirement of unanimous consent to change it. So we run into Rhode Island, who's always been, in this period of our history, cantankerous, wants everything their way, and you could count on them to disagree. So when this Congress, Continental Congress, and then moving into after 1781, a Confederation Congress, did vote finally for a tax, Rhode Island and New York said no. So you had 11, 13 of the states saying, let's do this, 2 saying no, it's a dead issue, because the requirement for unanimous consent to change things, imposing a tax, actually imposing tax, would have been contrary to the voluntary agreement part of the Articles of Confederation. Well, enough about that. So the system is badly designed. And so how did it function? Well, we had problems with the function as well. First of all, what are we going to do about the war debt? I think you know enough about American history to know that we borrowed our way through the Revolution. We owed money to the English, to the Scots, to the Dutch, to the French, to the Spanish. We owed money everywhere because we were hat in hand to all of those powers or individual within those countries asking for money. So how are we going to deal with that, with this voluntary agreement and the inability to collect taxes. So we have to find some way to deal with that. I said that there was no common currency, and there wasn't. In fact, it was worse than just saying no common currency, because even if you said pound sterling, said, well, okay, that will be our common currency. What's a pound? Well, to Virginia, it was, I'm inventing these numbers, it was 1,050 grams. And to Pennsylvanians, no, it's 1,080 grams. So we had this problem with not only the inability to decide exactly what would be the currency, that is what would have a common value, but how that was to be established. That is how it was to be measured. So that was a difficulty. And then, of course, apart from the debt, how do we pay to operate? Does this new government have an army, for example? Does it have a navy? Does it have a capital? Does it have a State Department? The answer to all of those questions is yes, but the only one really functioning was the State Department. We had ambassadors, Thomas Jefferson, the ambassador to France, John Adams, the ambassador to England, John Jay, the ambassador to Spain. So we had ambassadors. Who's paying for that? So the government's got to come up with money to pay for it. But for the reasons we already mentioned, they aren't able to raise that money through what they call requisitions, the inability to collect requisitions. They aren't able to borrow much because they're so deeply in debt. Who is going to lend them more money? So borrowing money was chancy at best. So these were all functional problems, quite apart from the design. These were difficulties. Now we have foreign policy, we have land and boundary disputes, we have the admission of states. I want to come back to our map. So here we have Massachusetts, and here we have land claimed by Massachusetts. Here we have Connecticut, and here we have land, including what's also claimed by Pennsylvania, claimed by Connecticut. Here's Virginia. This is the western counties of Virginia. This is the Ohio River. Virginia's charter allowed them to claim everything, that's the Mississippi River, everything east of the Mississippi River to the border of Pennsylvania. So Virginia claims that land. So before we go much farther, we have Virginia, Connecticut, Massachusetts, all claiming land at one point or another on the continent that is claimed by somebody else. And then we'll add the fourth, and that's New York. That's the green line on the map. If you can see the green, I'm tracing it. That green line is claimed by New York. So we have this difficulty of land boundaries. So something's got to be done about that. And something was done in 1781, but it took forever is not the right word. It took a long time to get it implemented. So these disputes continued. So much they continued that there was actual warfare in this area of Pennsylvania between Pennsylvanians and folks from Connecticut, all claiming the same land. So, of course, everybody is turning to the national government and saying to this confederation, settle this thing. Well, it's a little bit difficulty. Every state having one vote, unanimous consent required for certain changes. So it's possible for one state to block things. This is just a nightmare. So that's the problem with land boundaries. And then there were foreign boundaries. We had boundary disputes with Great Britain all along this line and up in this area. We had boundary disputes with Spain down in this area. And to make matters worse, in 1783, Spain closed New Orleans to any American trade. Now, if you close New Orleans, you essentially close the Mississippi River. For the folks living out here, and there weren't that many, but there were enough to make it an issue, the Ohio River joining the Mississippi River, leading to New Orleans, was the way for them to get things out, things they might want to trade in the larger world market. Why not go east? Well, the problem is it was 1 month from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. So the same problem, the Appalachian chain running right through there, makes it very difficult for the folks on the western side to get serious interchange with folks on the eastern side. So why am I telling you all this? Well, if the delegates to the convention in 1787 were the product of their experience, this is their most immediate experience. What's the biggest problem in Congress today? Dealing with the coronavirus. Why is that? Why isn't it the problem of nuclear weapons? Why isn't it climate change? Because the coronavirus is the immediate problem. The folks who went to Philadelphia in 1787, like everybody in the history of the world, is dealing with the most important immediate problem now. So you can talk, as some in our courts and some in our political discourse talk about what the founding fathers were thinking about abortion, what the founding fathers were thinking about free speech. By the way, free speech is no part of the Articles of Confederation. Free speech is also no part of the Constitution. That was not an issue at all. So the framers of the Constitution were certainly not thinking about free speech, not even freedom of religion. That's also not in the Constitution. Now, it's in the Constitution now, but it wasn't in the Constitution they dealt with. It's in the Constitution now because the Constitution was amended and added the free speech and religion and due process rights and fair and right to trial, etc. Those things were added later. They were not part of the discourse at the time. So obviously something has to happen. We are in a downward spiral in 1783, 84, 85, 86. We were in a downward spiral. And the concern was that this whole thing is going to collapse. And if it collapses, what's next? What's next is the French, the Spanish, the English are going to be picking us apart. Spain's right there on our southern border now. By 1787, France has begun to regain Louisiana. It's Spanish in 1783, but as time goes along, the French begin to regain power in that territory. In fact, if you remember your history, it was 1803 that Napoleon sold Louisiana to the United States. Right? So this territory is up for grabs, so to speak. So all of these things are the experience that these folks had. Now we get to 1780 already, and remember this new Articles of Confederation around since 1787. Yes, 1777. The draft had been floating around. Took a number of years. We were engaged in a war at the same time. Took a number of years before it got accepted. But 1781, in 1780, 1 year before it's formally adopted, there's already talk about we need to make changes. Because they were living under, in this rump government, they were living under essentially the Articles of Confederation in its draft form. So by 1780, they knew this is not working well. We've got to do something about that. So there was nothing was done. 1784, again, a call for revisions, nothing. 1785, said, well, this is a failure. Let's break this thing up and have 3 confederations. We'll have a Southern Confederation and the Atlantic Confederation and a New England Confederation. There's more chance if we do that, the argument went, with more chance that the New Englanders will be able to agree with each other. Yeah, fat chance on that, but in any event, there's a chance. In the Mid-Atlantic, maybe perhaps New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, maybe Maryland could join together. And then there's the South, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. They will be able to agree. Well, that didn't go very far. It's not exactly clear why, but it didn't go very far. In any event, it would have taken a unanimous agreement of all 13 of the states under the Articles of Confederation to even divide the Confederation into three parts. And we've already seen that that's a difficult proposition. Then in 1785, Virginia and Maryland on their own got together to try to solve problems between the two states, essentially the Potomac River being the boundary between the two states. They were dealing essentially with where's the dividing line in the river, how do we deal with traffic on the river, et cetera. Common problems that the two states had. That meeting was eventually moved from Alexandria to Mount Vernon. It became called the Mount Vernon Convention Conference. And the folks at that conference began to think, Virginians primarily, you know, if this worked so well with just the two states, what if we invited all the states to participate in a discussion of our common problems? One would think that's what Congress was for, but put that aside for the moment. They tried to do that, and they called for a convention in Annapolis, and only 7 states showed up. So the Annapolis Convention really didn't accomplish much, except they laid the plans for a meeting that Congress would call, and they would meet in Philadelphia. And perhaps then, if Congress called the meeting, rather than Virginia calling the meeting, maybe everybody would show up. That was the hope. So they designed it, and they also worked out some schemes about what might be presented at that conference. Who were the schemers? James Madison from Virginia, John Dickinson from Delaware and Pennsylvania, and Alexander Hamilton from New York. This Annapolis Convention, while it accomplished nothing in concrete terms and by way of an agreement, was rather critical. So they did petition Congress to call a convention. The petition went in 1786. Well, not much happened. We've talked about the Congress and legislature, etc. Not much happened until in the latter part of 86 and the early part of 1787, there was essentially a rebellion an armed rebellion in Western Massachusetts. It's called Shays' Rebellion. Daniel Shays happened to be a Revolutionary War veteran and a farmer, and he managed to get farmers together to rebel against the courts foreclosing on farm properties. The economic reason for that had to do with lenders in Boston wanting to be paid for money they had lent to farmers. When the farmers were unable to pay for a variety of reasons, the creditors demanded they be paid, and they wanted to be paid in hard currency. And farmers simply had no access to hard currency. Well, if you can't pay, we foreclose on your property. Sorry, that's the way it goes. Well, a lot of farms were foreclosed on, but it reached a point where Shays gathered together other farmers. They physically closed the courts in Western Massachusetts. And that, of course, created a good deal of alarm. So the Massachusetts government tried to do something about it. That ended up with armed conflicts. The Massachusetts government asked the national government for help. The national government said, what are we going to do? We really don't have an army, and I'm not sure we could get the money from anybody to fund anything. Well, it ended up that the Massachusetts had to call out its militia from the Boston area, and there was a conflict in Springfield. So this is beginning to look pretty grim, and in fact was pretty grim. There were deaths that were involved. And so people like George Washington, our hero from the Revolutionary War, the most prominent American figure, at that time, was alarmed that we were going to tear ourselves apart. So Washington got behind the move for a convention to be called. And so Congress did, in fact, in 1787, call a convention for the sole and express purpose, Sorry. Yeah, this is out of hand. There we go. For the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. That's important language, it turns out, because one of the problems when they gather in Philadelphia is, do they have authority to do anything other than to offer up amendments to the Articles of Confederation, remembering that it takes unanimous consent to amend the Articles of Confederation. So this is going to turn out to be a problem, but this is in fact the resolution that Congress passed. As a result, 74 delegates were appointed. Of the 74, 55 attended. 29 attended consistently, as I said before, and on signing day, September 17th, the signing day, 39 signed, 3 refused to sign. So there were 42 who attended on the final day. I mentioned John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, both of whom were in the Foreign Service at this point and were not available to attend the convention. I'm sure had they been in the country, they would very definitely have been at the convention. And the convention might have turned out differently, by the way, had they both been there, but they were not. Sam Adams from Massachusetts, George Clinton, the governor of New York, and Patrick Henry and Richard Henry Lee from Virginia declined to attend for varying reasons, but Henry and Richard Henry Lee and refused to attend, as did George Clinton, because they feared the loss of state power. They resisted a national convention because they feared that convention would do something other than having voluntary state participation in the national government. Today, we would call that a states' rights issue. So among the other things we might get out of tonight's talk is the states' right debate, which we experience all the time. Present politics in the United States is as old as the Constitution itself, and probably as old as the country. So who are these 55 folks who attend? Well, here's a profile. I'm not sure what we learned from it, but you can see that a number of these folks have been deeply involved in the government. That is to say, their experience that they bring to this convention includes some interesting things. They were around for the Continental Congress that produced the Declaration of Independence. They were around for the Revolution. They were around to serve in the Congress after we had an Articles of Confederation. 38 of them served in the Confederation Congress, and 9 were serving in that Congress in 1787 while they were also attending the convention. Congress was meeting in New York. The convention was in Philadelphia. So we had these 9 folks running back and forth between these two bodies that were meeting. And then you can see there were state court judges, there were lawyers, there were merchants, and large plantation owners, and they were all white, all male, and almost all Protestant. So that's a rough profile. I might say, by the way, that in 1776, when the Declaration of Independence was adopted by the Continental Congress, they also asked their delegates to go back to their now states, former colonies, and draft a constitution for their states. So a number of these folks have already drafted a constitution for their state governments. So we have some experience here. About these delegates, this collection of delegates, Thomas Jefferson, when he saw the list of names, said, this is an assembly of demigods. He meant that in a positive sense. 1840, this is 53 years later, Alexander de Tocqueville, who is a famous French social observer and historian, toured the United States, and his judgment was the choicest talents and noblest hearts which ever appeared in the New World. How you would know that is beyond my ability to fathom, but that was his opinion. That was an opinion held by George Mason, by the way, a Virginia delegate, prominent Virginia delegate, the author of Virginia's Bill of Rights. He thought in June of 1787, which is essentially a week or two into the convention, that these were outstanding individuals to be admired for their willingness to participate and overlook self-interest, etc. A year later, after spending the whole summer, and by the way, being one of the three refusing to sign the Constitution, his opinion was that everybody except those from Virginia were not worth much. So the summer obviously wore on George Mason, and it wore on a lot of others as well. It's one of the remarkable facts of history and of historical reporting that our record of the origins and original meanings of our nation's most revered document is so overwhelmingly dependent on the diligence and honor of just one man. That man was James Madison. When the convention sat the first day, it elected George Washington as president. So he presided over the convention. We'll see in a moment that there was another body called the Committee of the Whole, over which he did not preside, but he presided over the convention. They elected a secretary. His name was William Jackson. And Jackson sat at a table just to the right of Washington. James Madison from Virginia took it upon himself to walk up, pull up a chair to that table, sit beside the secretary, and record. The claim being he recorded every word in his own shorthand, and then went back to his room at night and on weekends and wrote out from his shorthand what those were. That combination of paper, and Madison attended every day. That combination of notes became Madison's notes. Is there any other source comparable? The answer is no. So Professor Beeman is talking about the fact that we rely almost entirely on those notes. There are lots of problems with those notes. Recent research has done chemical analysis of the paper in the 1840 version, because these notes were secret to almost everyone until Madison died. And then the notes became available. The paper on those notes, which were purportedly written in 1787, was of several different kinds, some of it not produced until the 1830s. So obviously, either the notes were rewritten and weren't in fact written at the time, etc. Changes were made. I'm not suggesting chicanery here. I'm just saying Beeman's point that it's remarkable that we are stuck relying on these notes as our sole source. Well, they aren't the sole source. Others took notes, but nobody took notes thoroughly every day. Nobody purported to write down word for word what was said. So these notes from Madison are the source for what we're about to look at now. So they organized themselves, and they organized themselves in such a way. My analogy here is we've got a jigsaw puzzle. We don't have a picture to guide us on how to put it together. The pieces are irregularly shaped, and we're asked to put this together and create a picture. We have no guide. It's not exactly right. Massachusetts had a fairly thorough constitution, and it looks an awful lot like the Constitution we ultimately adopted in 1787 at this convention and ratified in the following year. So there were some models they had. So this isn't exactly right. But in terms of organization, if you had such a problem, you might make several tries at putting pieces together. And some may appear to fit, but as you work your way around, you see, well, that really doesn't fit. We need to change that. So the point being, they decide something on day one. When they get to day 10, they have a related issue and they see, wait a minute, these two things don't go together. We want to be able to change. So they had this process. The Committee of the Whole that considers things and makes a decision. They report out to the convention, and then the convention considers what the committee has recommended, and they adopt it. The peculiar part of this is that exactly the same people are in the committee of the whole, that's why it's the committee of the whole. Everybody's a participant in it, and the convention. So what they're really doing is saying, okay, this is what we think right now. When we get to actually finalizing this thing, we want to have the power to reconsider it. That's one way. Then they adopted a further proposal for reconsideration. And then they adopted a proposal which said, when we are unable to agree on something, rather than spend our time endlessly arguing about that issue, let's postpone it and come back to it later. Maybe in light of a week or two being away from the issue, we'll be able to come to an agreement. And then finally, they agreed that it all would be secret. We pledge ourselves to hold in this room what takes place in this room. The document will speak for itself. None of us can tell what took place in this room. That's the pledge of secrecy. Now, there's nothing new about it in 1787. That's the way legislatures operated back then. It doesn't not to say that people behaved consistent with the pledge. It is to say that there's nothing unique about it. Some historians have made much of this secrecy provision. There's nothing unique about it at all, not in 1787. Okay, so the convention gets started. The convention starts with James Madison, Governor Randolph from Virginia presenting Madison's plan. Madison's plan becomes called the Virginia Plan, and it offers on day one, here are a series of resolutions for your consideration. What's the first thing that they do? They say, we adopt the principle that we are creating a national government. Bang, the Articles of Confederation is gone. What was the purpose of this convention again? What is its authority? The sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. The first formal action they take dumps the Articles of Confederation without saying so. So Delaware stands up and says, we're here under instructions and we can't live with that. So we're leaving. And the answer is, oh, wait a minute. Remember, we reconsider everything. So the fact that we adopted this now doesn't mean that that's going to be the final. But why don't you stick around and see what happens? It's not exactly the way the conversation went, but that's the effect of it. So Delaware does, in fact, stay. Oh, by the way, Rhode Island never showed up. And New Hampshire isn't there either. So we're not dealing with 13, we're dealing with 11. So we still haven't faced this unanimous problem yet. We'll have to face it sooner or later. So this is the nature of what Virginia presented. That's not a constitution. The articles ought to be corrected to accomplish objectives. Well, that's fine. Nothing wrong with that, except it doesn't tell us anything about how this is to be done. So it's not exactly a constitutional provision. And the second provision, the rights of suffrage ought to be proportioned. Well, now that's interesting, because the Articles of Confederation provide one state, one vote. So if it's going to be proportioned, that means it's not going to be one state, one vote. So we're not very deep into the Virginia plan either before we see that the Articles of Confederation is not going to survive. In fact, the Virginia plan includes a number of things. A bicameral legislature, not true of the Articles. The power of the national government will be to legislate in all areas where the states are incompetent, like interstate commerce, for example, and where national harmony might be disrupted. Oh, you mean like over slavery? So these things, this provision, if adopted, would give the national government enormous power it did not hold before. And we run through the rest of these things, but you get the idea. The Articles of Confederation are going to be left in the dust. So let's come to a couple of the big issues here. Suffrage is one, that is representation. One state, one vote is on the line. The small states, that is to say, New Jersey, Delaware, Connecticut, which views itself as a small state, South Carolina, and Georgia. That's a pretty good block of votes. They are small states. Their fear, their concern is that if you proportion Virginia and Massachusetts combined with Pennsylvania will have more votes than anybody else, they'll be able to do whatever they want. So it will be large states dominating small states. That's not acceptable to the small states. Certainly not acceptable to Delaware. They've already told us they're there under instructions. So this is going to be a heavily debated proposition. And it was heavily debated for many, many days. So how do we get past this? Remember, these are essentially politicians. These are essentially politicians. This is overwhelmingly a political process. And so how do we get beyond an apparent roadblock? You find a compromise. These people understood that. They had lived in their state governments for many years. They understood that the way you get something done is to compromise. We somehow have managed to forget that, but that's essentially what's happening here. So the people from Pennsylvania, represented by James Wilson, get together with people from South Carolina, represented by John Rutledge, and the two of them put together a deal. That is to say, John Rutledge will pull together the Southern votes, the small state votes, to vote with the large states for proportional representation if the large states will support the protection of slavery. So 1787, in this convention, the seeds are being planted for the Civil War. I'm sure that's not what they intended. It's not the way they saw things, and there's no reason why they would or should. Simply saying that this is an integral part of the deal that made it possible. Without this deal, by the way, without a compromise of some kind, the convention is over. And I don't want to play if this happened, if that happened, and so on. But there's serious doubt that the country would have survived. They would have had to find a way, but they didn't. So proportional representation is extensively argued, and they come up with this idea of we'll have equitable representation and we'll count people, and say we'll do this by population rather than wealth or some other formula for proportionality. We'll do this by population, and we'll allow the slaves, doesn't say that, it says 3/5 of all other persons. Well, this is slaves that we're talking about. So slavery is counted. The 3/5 provision allowing Virginia to count its slaves is directly related to the fact that we have so many Virginian presidents in the early part of our history. So many from Virginia and from the South. And the reason for that is that ultimately we decide we're going to use the Electoral College, the same one we use today. We're going to use the Electoral College. And who is in this Electoral College? It is the number of representatives you have plus the number of senators you have. So if you have 10 representatives and 2 senators, you get 12 electoral votes. If you have 5 representatives and 2 senators, you get 7 electoral votes. Virginia and the South pick up 11 electoral votes as a result of the 3/5 rule. Daniel Webster, that famous New Hampshire man who moved to Massachusetts and was a national figure and a constitutional lawyer, argued against this 3/5 rule. It was part of the Constitution, so it would require a constitutional change, which would have been impossible, but he argued against it as being unfair. But this provision was adopted and moved forward. Now, it wasn't adopted without a major fight. And the major fight came from New Jersey and from a delegate by the name of Patterson. He presents the Jersey plan and it says, wait a minute, we're here to revise the Articles of Confederation. Let's revise the Articles of Confederation. We'll put in more power for the Congress, and we'll put in adoption of a supremacy clause, which says the national law will be supreme to the laws of the state. So there's a lot of give in this thing, but he would preserve the one state, one vote. And so this is kind of an effort to put together the push that's there for a new form of government with the old form of government. So that gets debated for quite a while, and another compromise is hammered out. And the compromise is essentially the framework we have today, it put into the Constitution. But that argument went on for a long time. And on July 10th, seeing that they lost the argument, 2 of the 3 New York delegates leave. So now New York's out of the picture because they have only 1 delegate left, Alexander Hamilton, but they don't have a quorum. So the state of New York is no longer represented after July 10th. That's going to be a big problem when we get to ratification. New Hampshire doesn't show up until July 23rd. A lot of water has gone over the dam by July 23rd, but New Hampshire just shows up on the 23rd. Where have they been? Well, the answer is pretty straightforward and pretty New Hampshire. The legislature refused to fund it. And so until John Langdon personally stepped forward and said, I'll spend my money for myself and Nicholas Yeoman to go to Philadelphia and represent New Hampshire. So there they are on the 23rd of July. We get to the end of July and people are beginning to scratch their head and say, you know, we've adopted all these policies, but we don't have a constitution. So why didn't a committee draft the Constitution? And they did, and they reported out on the 6th of August. They did some things that were previously discussed and adopted. They added items and they changed some items. And essentially the changes create more protection for slavery and more limitations on commercial protection for New England. That commercial protection protecting slavery, but detrimental to New England interests. So there's a big fight. The compromise that they introduced in their draft is not a compromise at all. It just highlights the slavery issue about which there was considerable debate for several weeks. And again, a committee is formed and the committee reports out its version. Now, it does protect slave trade for 20 years. It ends up being 20 years. At this point, it's 13, but it gets amended to be 20 years. They subject slavery to taxation, etc. And that was adopted 7-4. And that was coupled with a fugitive slave provision, again by a vote of 7-4. This is telling you that we have 11 states as the maximum number of states ever participating, even though the names change, it's 11 states is the max that participate at any time. So fugitive slave, along with the 3/5 rule, now we've got the second seed for the Civil War. From 1850 to 1860, the Fugitive Slave Act was the principal issue and led to the kind of controversies in which somebody like Daniel Webster, who had been a local hero, but who supported the Compromise of 1850 that provided enforcement for this provision of the Constitution as part of an effort to try to save the Union. He was essentially written out and was an unpopular figure in his home territory as a result of that. So we get through the rest of the month of August, and you get to August 31st, and what happens then is somebody says, you know, we only have 2 weeks left. We have to be out of here because the Pennsylvania legislature is coming back, and we're using the Pennsylvania Legislative Hall for this convention. So we have to get out of here. So they create a committee to deal with the postponed parts. And what you see on the slide is the list of the postponed parts. So in 2 weeks' time, we're going to have to deal with defining the tax power, war powers, the location of the capital, exclusive control over money bills, and the executive branch. Whoa, the executive branch, we know we're going to have one. We've already decided that. We just don't know what it's going to look like. We don't know how the president's going to be elected. We don't know who's going to elect the president. There's just all these variety of nitty-gritty issues that are attached. And we're going to look at just one of them, but keep in mind that in 2 weeks' time, they're going to have to resolve one way or another all of these issues. They've been at it for a long time, and there's a lot of bad blood as a result of the controversy and the conflicts. So this is what the committee produced for an executive. We'll have one person to be the president, and that will serve a 4-year term. We aren't going to have a committee. We aren't going to have a troika of any kind. These are various proposals which over time have been proposed, argued about, and apparently not adopted. We're going to have a vice president. We haven't heard until this time, this committee's report, we haven't heard about a vice president. We had the president of the Senate who might serve in that kind of a capacity in a prior proposal, but we didn't have a vice president. We'd have election by electors who will be directed by the state. That's your electoral college. Each state has electors, a total of reps and senators. The person with the highest vote gets to be president. The person with the second highest vote gets to be vice president. That's going to be problematic, to say the least. In the second president we have, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson being his vice president. They hold vastly different views. If there's a tie in the election, it'll be resolved in the House and or the Senate. The power to negotiate treaties would be in the president with the advice and consent of the Senate, and the president would be impeachable by a trial in the House, a trial in the Senate after impeachment by the House. So much of this survived intact. Some of it was changed after this report came out, but it was done rather quickly. In the 1800 election, which was a mess, decided in the House of Representatives, it's Thomas Jefferson's first term. James Madison's comment was that the presidency and the Constitution was the product of hurrying influence produced by fatigue and impatience. You could say that about everything on that list of postponed parts. All of it was decided in that 2-week period under the hurrying influence produced by fatigue and impatience. So we get to the point where there is finally a constitution. It's got to be cleaned up. That thing they did back in August, it was 26 articles. It was convoluted. The language wasn't entirely clear. They knew that wasn't going to be the model. They said, we need a committee. They created a committee. Johnson from Connecticut, Madison from Virginia, Hamilton from New York, Morris from Pennsylvania, and King from New York. That was the committee. The committee decided that Morris, Gouverneur Morris, who was a representative from Pennsylvania, although he lived in New York, that's another story. In any event, he was the drafter of the Constitution. He is the father of the language, we the people, that preamble, which is instantly famous and applauded around the world. He's the author of that, not James Madison, which is commonly believed. The draft was reported to the convention on the 12th. There were last-minute revisions. They happened to be very minor indeed, from the 12th to the 15th. And then on the 17th, signing day, Ben Franklin, who attended a lot, not every day. He was very ill. He never spoke, but he handed written comments to Wilson of Pennsylvania, and Wilson spoke for Franklin. So Wilson is delivering this last day speech, and I want to call your attention especially to this. I wish every member who may still have objections would with me doubt a little of his own infallibility and make manifest our unanimity. It's to make this doubt a little of his own infallibility, which is, I think, words to guide every legislator, most of whom will not be impressed at all. This is the language of Thomas Jefferson in 1816. So this is roughly 30 years after the convention. Some men look at constitutions with sanctimonious reverence and deem them too sacred to be touched. They ascribe them to the men of the preceding age a wisdom more than human. I knew that age well. It was very like the present, but without the experience of the present. And 40 years of experience is worth a century of book reading. And this they would say themselves. This is after 30 years. We are now over 200 years since the adoption of the Constitution, and we have that experience to look at. So what were they thinking? They were thinking we have a lot of problems. We got to get to dealing with these problems, and the way we get there is by compromise. That's what they were thinking. Thank you. Other questions?
I don't know if it's not really a question, but when the pandemic first hit earlier this year, and we all learned that, they were asking people to stay in place and to wear a mask. There were a lot of people that were talking about how the Constitution was meant to be fluid. Did you hear all that? And I'm not sure exactly what they meant, but I'm wondering if it's true that, as time goes on, like you said, it's been 200 years,
Well, I don't think a single answer can be given to your question. You would think after all the years, some of these basic things would be settled. When the Constitution was adopted, it included in the powers of Congress, which, unlike the provision proposed by the Virginians, was not a broad sweeping general authorization of power, but was a list of powers, enumerated powers, we call them. So Article 1 of the Constitution lists the powers, but after it is numbered 17 specific powers the Congress has, it has an 18th, and the 18th is called the Necessary and Proper Clause. And what it says is Congress has the power to support the other powers we've listed, plus the powers that are in the executive branch, plus the powers that are in the judicial branch. So Congress can adopt laws to support them. Can be interpreted in a number of ways. So we'll start with 1816, when there was a huge fight over the constitutionality of the national bank. Did Congress have the power to create a corporation like a national bank?